100 years ago today, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the guns on the Western Front fell silent. It was the end of more than 4 years of war, the like of which the world had never seen before. After a series of ceasefire agreements, the war officially ended with the signing of the armistice between the German Empire and the Allies in the woods of Compiègne, northeast of Paris. Make no mistake, the First World War was a catastrophe. It saw hitherto unknown degrees of destruction and terror. Almost 70 million people were involved in fighting. More than 17 million died. With death on that scale, every community, every city, every country involved was a loser in some senses. And we still are. The seeds of conflict which were to engulf Europe again within a generation were sown, as were the seeds of conflict which continues to this day in the Middle East. New states were created in Europe. Borders were redrawn. The nationalities of local people were changed as, without moving, they found themselves living in different countries. Injustices were created which persist to this day. Can we really say the war ended? Only 21 years later, the guns were firing again. In some places, the language of victory is still heard. In other places, the loss of culture, heritage, and territory is still keenly felt. For some, everything is settled. For others, many wrongs remain to be righted. And we live once again in a dividing continent, a continent in which nationalism and hate and separation are on the rise. We look back over 100 years not to celebrate, but to be taught the lessons of history, lessons that we must ask, have we really learned? We live still with the legacies of the First World War, which over the intervening century have not been resolved. I'm going to mention 4 such legacies this morning. We live with a legacy of blame and guilt. But let us not make guilt a reason for not moving on. A whole constellation of reasons led to the outbreak of war in 1914. For many of the major powers, war was seen as a way out of their own crises. Many people saw their way to making huge profits from war. There was no nation whose motives for war were wholly venal, nor was there any nation whose motives were entirely pure, entirely noble, entirely altruistic. All bear a burden of guilt together. But the Christian faith shows us and teaches us that acceptance of guilt is the beginning of restoration and renewal. It is the first step to being a better person, a better church, a better nation. Because in accepting guilt, we are moved to examine the wrongs of the past and resolve not to repeat them. Do we still endorse and legitimize the attitudes and the systems of national pride, of militarism, of economic injustice, which create the conditions for war? Do we listen attentively enough to the voices which call us to walk the pilgrim way of justice and peace, to walk the way Christ leads? We live with the legacy of the trampling of minority rights. I've learnt about this over the years through my contacts with the church in Hungary. Present-day Hungary is about 2/3 of the size of its pre-First World War self. At the end of the war, in the years immediately following, territory was carved off to punish Hungary, and it was given to neighbouring states, and that created Hungarian minorities outside modern Hungary, many of whom have endured long-standing discrimination. And that story of creating minorities through the redrawing of borders was repeated in the Balkans and in Asia Minor and in the Middle East, where borders were redrawn with no regard for the people who lived on the land. For many people, the importance of national identity is on the rise in a way that is dangerous and divisive. Churches must raise our voices to witness to the essential unity of humanity, a unity which transcends religious, cultural, linguistic, or national divides. We are one because we are children of the one God, all of us. We live with the legacy of exile and migration. Over 9.5 million people were forced into exile throughout Europe during the First World War and its aftermath. Now, this was not an aberration, historically speaking. Exile and migration have been features of European life for centuries and continued through the Second World War and the Balkan Wars, and it continues to this day. In our remembering, we need to remember this complexity, this history. As European people in their millions have sought refuge in the past, now we are among those being asked to provide refuge. Those who forget history can harden their hearts, can erect boundaries, and close borders. Those who remember, really remember, cannot. We live with the legacy of the need for reconciliation. The need does not go away. Unless we constantly seek reconciliation, we fall into the ways which lead again to division, to fragmentation, to conflict, destruction, and death. As Christian people, as churches, we know the great gift of reconciliation with God through Christ. We who have experienced reconciliation must share that gift with the world. As people reconciled with God, our calling is to be agents of reconciliation. What does any of this have to do with the story of a poor widow whom Jesus saw giving 2 small coins to the temple treasury? Perhaps not much, but a little. That story is about humility contrasted with pride. And it's about sacrifice contrasted with ostentation. Often sacrifice is spoken of at this time of year as what happened on the battlefield. And it did. But what happened there was also carnage and murder, and we should not forget that. And if we are truly to honor those sacrifices, then we do that by living sacrificially ourselves, by sacrificing the self, by sacrificing the impulse to pride, by sacrificing the vanity of thinking one country is somehow better than another and its people better than those who live elsewhere, by sacrificing the attitudes which lead to exclusion and injustice, by sacrificing self-righteousness. And we honor the sacrifice made in the war now ended 100 years ago today, by humbly accepting that we bear a measure of guilt, and by offering welcome to those in need, by seeking reconciliation with all people, and by working together to build a better future and a peace that lasts. Amen.